All right.
Okay, wonderful. It is certainly fantastic to see people with us today, and especially as we are beginning our last week of webinars. It has been a great time, but before we begin, let us start with prayer. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Praise to you, God, for all your work among us. Yours is the vigor in creation. Yours is the impulse in our new discoveries. Make us adventurous, yet reverent and hopeful in all we do. Amen.
Amen.
We are so glad you are here, and we are thankful for the time that you have come to be with us and the time that you offer for us in these conversations together. I am Stephanie Gurnsey Higgins. I am the Minister for Diocesan Development and Giving, coming to you from my home this afternoon, just a little north of Richmond. And until a few minutes ago, we had some nice sunshine, but I hope it is a good day wherever you are. Julie?
My name is Julie Simonton. I am your Diocesan Minister for Congregational Development and Stewardship. I am coming to you from a little bit south of Richmond, where it is still sunny. So I'll send it your way. I live on the other side of the river, actually, so I actually live in the Diocese of Southern Virginia. Richmond is divided along the James, and I am on the other side. And we are so glad that you are here. Welcome to our webinar for narrative budgets for missional storytelling. Stephanie and I have wanted to launch webinars like this for some time now, and we're really glad that you are here with us. We look forward to this conversation and to hearing from you what would be the most helpful for your ministry and your church. As we move into what we've planned to share, we'd like to offer a few notes on how our time together will work. Our conversations are richer because you are here. It's really helpful for us to know who you are, so if you have not yet, please include your first and last name with your Zoom identification. Your questions are very welcome throughout the webinar, and the ministry work you are offering at your church is also important for us to hear. As we work through the webinar, please use either the chat function or the Q&A format to send us questions or to describe what's working at your church. These chat messages will come directly to Stephanie and me, and we will gladly relay the information to everyone attending the webinar. If Stephanie or I is talking, the other is watching the chat and the Q&A, so don't worry about interrupting the flow. You can go ahead and type in your remarks and your questions at any time. Many questions we hope we'll be able to answer during this webinar. If the question is really church specific, we will gladly take your information and be in touch with you separately. If the question is too large to answer completely here, we'll do the best we can with the time we have, and then perhaps include some of that information in a later webinar or information on our Facebook page. You can also bring your questions or comments to our Facebook page, send them to us by email, and we are always glad to schedule a virtual meeting with you, with anyone else in your leadership team. As well, all of our information to contact us, our resources, meetings, webinars, and links are available on our diocesan webpage and through our Stewardship and Development Facebook page, which are listed here in the chat. And finally, we will be grateful for your experience and ideas about what you would like for us to discuss during future webinars and how we might structure our time together in different ways here. And the best way to address your ideas, questions, and where you find the Jesus in your church and community. Please don't hesitate to be in touch with us during or after the webinar with your thoughts. All right. There is our contact information. Stephanie.
All right. I've got I'm getting some things set up.
Sorry.
That's all right.
For those of you who, I'm not sure how familiar you are with working with Zoom and trying to have notes and get these slides up, it takes a little bit of maneuvering. So thank you for your patience as we get everything organized.
That's all right. I forgot to share the screen at the beginning, so that was part of the reset. I apologize. But if I do that, then you can't see us. So that's okay. Screen is up. Okay, that's all right. And chat, so we can see the screen. My apologies, I should have done that first. But today we are going to talk about narrative budget for missional storytelling. And we're going to talk about the importance of telling stories in our human existence and what is a narrative budget, how to find the stories for your narrative budget, and ways to incorporate your narrative budget into your congregation's communications. We know the importance of telling stories because Jesus was a great storyteller. The only reason we generally have trouble figuring out what he was talking about is because of the barriers of language, the passage of time, and probably our own ego. We come from a tradition rich in story, and there is much for us to remember about the way Jesus told stories. First of all, he was inspirational. He always found a way to bring the crowd together, to bring people toward him. But he also found a way to connect to the individual with his stories. In fact, these stories connect to us still. This may seem like an impossible tightrope to walk because we are in fact not Jesus, but we'll talk about best practices that will help. Storytelling is also important to us because we, as humans, are social creatures. We learn about ourselves in relationship with one another, and stories are one of the most powerful ways in which we learn. Through stories, we take information with us out into the world and share it. Just think about the news feature you heard on a drive one day and couldn't wait to share once you reached your destination. Or something you read that you couldn't wait to talk about at the dinner table. That's how powerful stories are for us. I heard at a lecture years ago in college that humans were the only species that tell stories. We know that there are species that grieve and that talk, and these were once thought to be the things that made us unique, but we know now that we are the only species that tell stories the way that we do. There's this amazing research being done about the power of stories, and in fact, researchers now think that stories actually predated speech. It was our need to tell stories that drove our desire to communicate with language. We needed to teach others how to make fire, or to tell them about the dangers of wild animals, or not to eat poisonous berries. That's how powerful stories are to us. Are there stories that have made a significant difference in your life, that are foundational in your family or your congregation? Do you, especially in times like these, have books that you come back to time and time again? You might not know each of these books, and they might not have the same impact on you, positive or negative, that they have on me. But here are some very famous first lines. These first lines are enough to give me the setting, whether it's the rural South, or Napoleonic Paris, or a port city in Chile on Holy Thursday. These words begin to set the tone for what follows, the story. And why do we need to worry about how we tell stories? Because Jesus told us to go into the world and be like him, to love people and make disciples. And we know how Jesus did this. He told stories. He didn't use spreadsheets. We talked about this at the beginning, that Jesus used his stories to provide connections and make meaning in people's everyday lives And I think that's what we are tasked with as well. And I think that's what we can do with a narrative budget. So what is the difference between these two budgets? The one on the left is a financial budget, and it provides monetary information and nothing more. The one on the right provides stories that create context for the mission and ministry of your church. The financial budget on the left has a place. This budget ensures that your church is aware of its income and expenses. This makes sure that the lights stay on and the water bill is paid. This is important, but it is not the whole picture. And that's because the church is a people organization, and a spreadsheet does not make apparent what the people do for the work of the Lord. You should always make the financial budget available to those who request it. A copy is available in the office are very useful words. But you should use the narrative budget with your annual giving campaign. And we'll also talk about other ways in which you can incorporate it into your communications plan. So what is a narrative budget? It is simply a representation of the financial budget in descriptive terms that transforms the money and expenses into a picture of ministries of your congregation. We know, and research indicates, that churches often don't communicate the value of the ministries they provide and the changes occurring in personal lives through these ministries. Parishioners, therefore, have a limited understanding of the use of their gifts and of the relationship with those receiving the benefits of the ministries. So the narrative budget helps parishioners understand what the congregation is doing, how you are connecting them to the ministries, and creating deeper relationships through education and inspiration. It doesn't matter what it looks like, as long as it talks of impact, of mission and ministry, of your congregation and the community, a story. Excuse me. Here is one example. I'm going to point out some components that are good to keep in mind. It is, excuse me. It is always nice to have pictures. As humans, especially, we are attracted to ourselves, so pictures of people are really useful. Scripture is a wonderful component. It ties us back to the story that we are all part of. It is great, too, to include a description of the ministry, especially as it relates here to your congregation. And having an individual involved in the ministry actually write something about it from their perspective. It's a wonderful part of this. It is not important what it looks like, except that it reflects your own church and your context. Some narrative budgets are glossy 8.5 by 11 magazines. Others are trifold legal size paper, and still others exist only electronically. The output is not what's crucial. What's crucial is the way you connect the readers to the story you tell. While it's true that it is not important what it looks like, I do feel very strongly that there are some things that you should not do in your narrative budget. So before we even begin, we're going to look at those things not to do. I'm not going to tell you what church this is or in what diocese, only that I do not suggest doing your narrative budget like this. I do not suggest having expenses larger than your income without an attached explanation. And I do mean like attached right here. The first paragraph of their text, which was several pages away, does explain that they decided to operate at a deficit to make repairs. From my tone, I think you already know that that's not a good way to tell a story, though. So come up with a way to include the repairs in the chart if this is what you want to do. In your expenses, looking there, one main point of the narrative budget is that you have a better way to tell the story of staff compensation and clergy compensation. When folks look at the chart and see that it's 70% of your budget, this is not inspiring. It doesn't tell them anything about the work your staff is doing each and every day to make a difference in the ministries of your congregation. And while overhead has gotten an undeserved bad rap, we'll need to talk more about how to divide your staff and clergy compensation so that it tells a better story. And building maintenance is not a story. Your building has its own story to tell, but you have to help. And while we'll need to tell these stories a bit differently this year, because we may not be in our buildings as much, your building is about the ministry that happens when people's lives are transformed through 12-step programs, or the orchestra series, or Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, or yoga, or the thermos shelter, or your food pantry. These are groups that use your space. All are part of your building story. So include the time in the category that you choose. You would include your worship experiences and Christian formation as well. And we'll talk about how to do this in a little bit. This is how you tell the story of your building. Julie?
All right. Another important part of your storytelling is who knows the entire story. In many churches now, this includes your rector or vicar. If it does not, it should be thoroughly considered. You can read here in the canons that the rector, vicar, has the authority and the need to see all of the records of the church. While a church is not a regular nonprofit, it is important to try imagining a nonprofit or something in the private sector, or any organization with an executive director who does not know the source of sustaining income for the operating budget. It is an essential piece of healthy governance. There are indeed churches where the treasurer only has this information, and the information is maintained on a home hard drive. We have churches where relationships in the past have gone badly, the information has been held, or where the treasurer has been injured or sick, and the information cannot be accessed. Also, a piece of governance is that the clergy can have informed conversations with their treasurer when a single pledge supports 8% or more of a church's operating budget. If you have a single pledge that is supporting 8% or more of an operating budget, it is a piece of governance that deserves a conversation. Stephanie and I also have many clergy colleagues who have found out about divorce, sick parents, and a host of other pastoral care concerns through the pledge numbers. We know of churches where a new rector learned that his junior and senior warden combined pledged only about $400 together combined, but they were out in front as leaders of the church asking others to consider pledging, tithing, and pledging proportionally. Some church members are concerned that if the rector or vicar knows what the pledges are, that people will be treated differently. And quite honestly, if that is indeed true, it's time to talk about the tenure of your rector. Many churches, most people in the church assume that the clergy know. It can be generational. Most younger boomers, Gen Xers, and millennials assume that the clergy knows where the income for the operating budget comes from. If your clergy does not know and you decide to move into it, there are some different ways to approach that. You can put it on a pledge card as a simple little box to tick at the bottom for someone to opt out. It could read something like, if you do not want the clergy to know, check the box here. We've had some churches that have had great success with that. They didn't bring it up as a big conversation. They didn't make a big deal out of it. They just simply put it across the bottom of the pledge card. And no one checked it. So the church moved seamlessly into the rector having access. Now, if the rector does have access, it does not necessarily mean that he or she is in the finances all the time, but it does allow them to notice if there is a concern, either for the governance with the operating budget or because of pastoral care. You can also see here on this next slide with one of my favorite photographs. I say that every time I see it. On this next slide, this is a rubric from the Book of Common Prayer that instructs the clergy to make sure that finances are a piece of the conversation at a church. You can read here that provisions are made for the well-being of the family and that their estate is taken care of and the church is considered. So if you would like more information, if your church is not in this position and you're looking to move into it and you would like more information, Stephanie and I are really happy to have that conversation. We have it frequently. We actually just had one this week. So get in touch with us. We also have a number of resources of books, Cliff Christopher's Not Your Parents' Offering Plate, and Charles LaFon's, I always miss the name of this one,
Fearless Fundraising.
Thank you. I know it starts with an F. Fearless Fundraising. Charles LaFon's Fearless Fundraising are great resources, but Stephanie and I are really happy to have this conversation with you if you would like. Is there anything, Stephanie, that you would add to that?
No, I think those are
All right.
both great.
Great. Thank you.
So where do we start? To start creating your narrative budget, you'll look over the list of expenditures from your financial budget and think about the types of ministries your congregation is involved in. Make a list of the categories and maybe start with a brief sentence to describe what each ministry area involves. Eventually, it'll be nice to add appropriate scripture to these ministry categories too. And then begin to assign each line of the financial budget to a ministry category by placing it in that appropriate area. Most cases, it will be very clear. If it is not, check with your clergy or staff, because they'll probably know pretty quickly too. For clergy and staff salary and packages, begin by asking your clergy and staff to think about the work they do. How much time do they spend on these categories that you've chosen? The categories that we see most often are pastoral care, worship and music, outreach and mission, Christian formation, and church life. But you'll pick the ones that mean the most to you and work in your context, and pick the way that, word them the way that work best in your context as well. So to begin this, I will say, don't spend more than about 15 minutes on this, okay? I can tell you that the year that I was on the stewardship team at my home church and I helped with the narrative budget, I worked with our rector to figure out their time. As a small parish with one clergy person on staff, I didn't think it would be too hard, so I went through the budget and I came up with the percentages based on what I knew of the system, and I sent it to our rector for them to take a look. They weren't sure it was right, and I will agree I'm not the best when it comes to math. So they proceeded to do a deep dive into the budget, into their schedule, and spent nearly a week on this work. Their information was only different by 1%. I'm not telling you it wasn't a good exercise, but I'm telling you that my back of the envelope work is probably good enough for this. But it is good to remember to help your staff think beyond what happens when they sit and answer the phone in the office. Make sure that they consider their entire day and all of the days of the week, the length and the breadth of their work. Because when it comes to personnel, especially clergy, we're talking about more than what happens inside the office. We're talking about worship leadership, care for the sick, calling on the bereaved, representing your church in the community, teaching the gospel, and administrative support for the whole congregation. That salary and benefits package extends across a whole range of ministries and activities from which your church and community benefit. And a narrative budget helps to better tell that story. We can also acknowledge that there's obviously no typical week, and church work is seasonal. But start to think about what a week sort of looks like. And then you'll divide the compensation using the percentages, and you'll have a story that includes the impact of the work. And it'll begin to tell a story of the ministry that makes a difference in your community and for your congregation. So what about the building? No one joins your church to help you pay your bills. So let's tell a story of your church building. You have incredible ministries, some of them that you manage and some that others might manage. And of course, this year will be a little bit different. Unless you have a particularly large space that is contracted to a specific entity, I usually suggest that you take your building expenses and divide them roughly by the same amount that you've used to establish your ministry categories. I know it might seem weird this year, since you may not be using your building space for most of the year in the same way you usually do, but many of your expenses will probably be less too. And if you don't have as many stories to tell about your building this year, I think that's okay, because you're going to have many, many other stories to tell, because your ministries were in other places. They were outside your building. And some of them were even, through Zoom like this. And you will need to talk about them too. So where are you going to find this information? Because there's more to a narrative budget than the work of your clergy and your staff. The narrative budget should reflect what happens all through your church and by everyone involved in your church. So for each ministry category, write down some examples of what happens because of that ministry. You may want to talk to the people involved in each of the programs too. Reach out to them, have them tell you their stories. How did this ministry area make a difference in their life? How did the ministry make a difference to the community? Including pictures is wonderful, just like we said, but be careful not to include pictures that you don't have permission to use. And I would suggest too, especially this year, pictures of empty church buildings will not be uplifting. As Julie has mentioned in previous webinars, right now is a great time to keep track of events and pictures so that you can come back to them later. Nothing is worse than trying to remember the thing with the thing so that you can include it months after you saw it. So start now. Create a file, and it will be much easier. The good news is you will come across wonderful stories that can be shared through your narrative budget. And these stories will shape the way you then look at your annual giving for your mission and your ministry. Julie.
Step 5 is for you to develop a communication plan to share with your congregation throughout the year. Begin by using the narrative budget as part of your annual giving process. Use posters and bulletin inserts throughout the year to connect with parishioners. Highlight one ministry area each month to tell stories. Ask individuals to speak about the ministries they're involved in. Perhaps they'll write something for your e-news or record a short video for your social media page or to share online with your worship. And there is always a story to tell. Stephanie has heard me tell this story before, maybe some of you have as well, but it's one of my favorite. I had a colleague outside of the Diocese of Virginia who was telling a story about the dreaded moment when the junior warden gets up during the ministry minutes, during annual giving, and wants to talk about the HVAC system or the carpet or the old tiles, and how quite often that just is not the motivating moment that the clergy and everyone else is hoping for to give everyone the inspiration to really pledge generously. And so one Sunday, the clergy was up in the prayer desk. It was time for the ministry minute, and the junior warden came up. And the junior warden said, "I want to talk to you about these light bulbs." And the rector said he just started sinking down at the prayer desk thinking, oh, when are we going to start? We don't need to talk about light bulbs. And the junior warden said, I want to talk to you about these light bulbs. I'm the junior warden, and this is part of my ministry here. These light bulbs shined on me and my wife when we got married. They shined on both of our babies when we baptized them. And last month, many of you were here when these lights shined on my mama as we prepared to bury her. These light bulbs light a path to God's kingdom. And the congregation was captivated. So there are possibilities for a compelling, rich story. If there is a story that is important to tell, my hunch is if you give it some creativity and some thought, there is a rich story there, even if it's about your HVAC system. All right. So do we have the annual? Yes. Our annual giving program has, for last year and for this year, the logo includes a number of these icons that you see here on the screen. And these icons are a part of the many ministries that are involved in the church, and that's why they are in the main logo for annual giving and the logo for our Diocese of Virginia theme. But they are also available individually and in all of these different colors so that you too can take these icons and use them to tell a story, a narrative budget story if you want, around your church. You can take these and individually pull them out, hang them around the church. You can also, make a sticker, put them on name tags, hand them to the kids to color in with rainbows when you're all back together. These icons do not have specific designations. They are available for you to decide what story you want them to tell. We have a couple with hands. We have some that are outside. So choose the one that speaks most deeply to the culture and context of your congregation and the ministries that you offer, and use them. Be playful with them. Perhaps you could have a ministry bingo, but they are yours to use. If you used them last year, they are the exact same. We have that consistency just to help you out and provide that continuity. To please take these as you will and use them around your church to tell your story. Stephanie.
Thank you. I'm going to pause for a moment before we move on to think about the work that our churches do that we can't easily quantify. And there may be more of that work this year than most. Just because we can't mold our ministry into a chart doesn't mean we can't include it in our narrative budget. I love this quote, and I use it here because it's true, although it might not actually have been said by Mr. Einstein. Just because your church has something wonderful that can't easily be counted doesn't mean there isn't a place for it in a narrative budget. It just means that you get to use your creativity to find a place to tell that story in the best possible way. Does it belong in print? Maybe it would make a good video or a blog post because you could use a longer form to tell that story. Or maybe it's a shorter form, a ministry moment where someone could tell their story personally. These are good things to consider, good questions, and when you come up with these questions, write them down and keep them. They'll help you build this story, or maybe even another one as you go through this process. But what kind of things can you count? Depending on what the rest of the year looks like, there may be fewer of these items on the list to count, but I offer them as examples. You'll have worship in some form likely to count, or you'll have ways in which you reached out to parishioners that you can count. My congregation not only has maintained worship virtually, but we have a new service, so we would include that. We don't have a food pantry for ourselves, but we have become involved in a food pantry at a neighboring congregation. And we could certainly include the amount of food collected and dropped off to aid their food ministry. Outreach might be different this year too. My parish worked on a habitat house early in the year, but since the pandemic, volunteers aren't allowed to build. They were invited to a virtual open house by the new owner, and certainly we could include that story. We moved our supper club to a virtual environment in March, which not only extended it beyond its original time frame, but now allows for additional participation because no one has to worry about driving at night in the dark. So think about ways in which your congregation has maintained connections with one another. Think about ways that your congregation has made a difference in your community. There may be items you can count here. There will certainly be stories that you can tell. So now we're going to begin to look at some different ways that congregations have chosen to express their narrative budgets. This was from St. Peter's in the Woods webpage. Quick screenshot taken right from their webpage, some quick numbers, and it tells a quick story about them. It tells you something about themselves as a community, what they have done across a year, and I just love it. This example is from a church in Georgia, and I love this purely online narrative budget. Here's some great key elements to notice. They've brought along a piece from their story. So this is the Christian education piece, but here were the other ministry areas that they chose. You can see the percentage and dollar amount portion that they included here. Lots of pictures, multi-generational pictures. It's wonderful. You see the areas of ministry in their congregation, and then you see the brief narrative that gives a fuller explanation of the work in their congregation. And we love these narrative budget posters from St. Stephen's Culpeper that they did a few years ago. This church has an average Sunday attendance of around 125, but look how simple math tells a story of a tremendous and passionate ministry. If you have a food pantry, you have already collected this information. I know you have. And this one beautiful picture tells such a fantastic story. We're not even going to leave St. Stephen's here because this is such a beautiful photo. I have to include it. If you want to take a look at your worship experiences together as a congregation for any year, especially last year, you'll have all of this in a parochial report. And if you spent 5 minutes using simple math, you could figure out this level of detail. But you might even this year want to think about what your virtual worship would look like and what kind of picture you would include that would elaborate on what that virtual worship looked like for you. For most of the year, as we know, our worship might look different. And that's also good for us to remember. Many of us learn to do so much that is new to us and in such a short period of time. We learned to Zoom practically overnight. And as Julie and I were talking about, we have learned iMovie and other things to figure out how to edit video pretty quickly. We've learned Facebook Live. We've learned YouTube. If you have become proficient very quickly in some of these, it's good. It's okay. You can tell these things. We can now run a small movie studio out of our living room. We should tell these stories. It's okay to pull the curtain back and let people see what it took to make this happen. Our social time together is different too. How did y'all stay connected? Did you do Zoom coffee hour? Did people set up FaceTime check-ins? Did you even not do the virtual route? Did people stand at the end of the driveway or do the end of the porch type of connecting? These are great things to include in your narrative budget. I'd also like to suggest that sometimes it's okay to tell a story of aspiration. Sometimes we won't have won yet. We didn't achieve our goal. And this is a year when we probably need to give ourselves a lot of grace and remember that we are all learning. We've experienced a lot of challenges, and for many people, their health and the health of their loved ones have been critical concerns. So maybe the plans you had at the beginning of the year need to be refocused and reconsidered in the perspective of aspiration. Many years ago, and I desperately wish I could find the picture, I remember getting a beloved IKEA catalog. And I turned the pages, and on the page on one side was a picture of one cardboard box. And on the facing page was a short paragraph that explained that this was the one item they made that had recycled products, or maybe it was 100% recycled products, I can't remember. But it described the hard work they were doing to do better. Well, now, even if you don't know a lot about IKEA, you'll probably get that they do a lot better, as you can see from the current online materials. They have moved the bar. They tell a different story. But they didn't hesitate to start with a story of something small and give themselves something to aspire to. And I think we can do that too. Here's an example from St. Stephen's, Richmond, of a number, a photo, and a few words of storytelling, and it makes a tremendous impact. They took inspiration from the numbers page of a Real Simple magazine, and as you begin to think about how to tell your stories, also think about what you might want it to look like. As you flip through magazines and read articles in the newspaper or online, look at other churches' narrative budgets online for inspiration, think about how you would want your narrative budget to look like. And this narrative budget from St. Mary's in Goochland has a little bit of everything we've talked about. There's a lot of stories here, a lot of pictures, and information that represents these stories. People will literally see themselves represented here in these pages, remembering the times that they had. It's important to remember that emotions, not logic, drive our decision making. And as much as we like to think that we as humans are rational beings, we use our head as backup, and our heart actually drives our actions. So remember, you want to touch people's emotions when you're telling your stories. You want to make them feel. Our goal should be to make sure that most of our entire congregation is represented in some way, in some aspect of our narrative budget. All of our ages and the demographics that we have, from the new folk who've just joined, and all the folks who have grown up in our church, everyone in between. We can be creative in the way we look at how we ask questions and the way we present information. Think about the ways that your ministries work. Think about the time that parishioners meet with people and the ways in which they interact with folks in the community. Do you have a festival or organize a community event? Did it take place before we closed? Or perhaps maybe it will even be able to take place later in the year. Maybe you were even able to shift it to a virtual space. Those will be incredible stories to tell. Maybe you participate in a farmer's market during the summer. You might think about the many jars of pickles or jam or the whatever your church makes that you make for your booth. It's fun to keep track of how many bushels or tomatoes it takes to make St. Marinara, or the cucumbers for your Episcopals. You can also include the time of the wonderful people who prepare them. And if you're updating your narrative budget this year, remember, don't try to change too many things. Pick one thing, maybe two. First of all, you don't want to overwhelm yourself with trying to do everything. And also, if you make too many changes in one year, you won't know what worked and what didn't. So, one thing, maybe two. Remember, narrative budgets are about a paradigm change. It's about looking at our lives in a new way. It isn't about budgeting to keep the lights on. It's about budgeting as an opportunity to deepen the spiritual life of your congregation by creating a faith community and increasing awareness of the need to support your ministries with a financial commitment. So as you work on your own narrative budget, be sure to be in touch with us. We love to hear and to see what you come up with. And as you have questions, please feel free to reach out to us.
Excellent. Thank you. This is a great opportunity now for you to send in any questions if you have them, either through the chat or the Q&A. You can see here that we have our connection points highlighted for you through our website at thediocese.net, and we are working diligently to put together a new web page for stewardship. So when you go over the next day or so, it might look very different than it's going to look next week. We've tried to tidy it up and make the information easier to find. So just know that if you go there in the next couple days and then you come back and it looks completely different next week, that's a good thing, because then we were able to finish it and get it looking like we wanted to. We also have our new Facebook page, which is available. We post there every day. It gives information about our webinars and all the information on our website, as well as up-to-date information on resources that we're finding, articles that we're reading, notes from other churches from around the diocese that we think might be helpful for you to see. So if you're in a position and you have something to send us that you would like to share with others, please do, and we will gladly put that on our Facebook page as well. Let's see, do we have, we've got some notes here. No, my hunch is we'll have many churches working to count online services offered and what that means. That is indeed true. See, I don't see any Q&A in here. So in the end, please do keep in touch with us. Let us know how you get along, what you decide to do with your narrative budgets and the way you communicate. I know many of you have some really powerful storytelling tools, especially with new websites that you've designed. So do send us the way that you keep things updated and keep everyone connected while we are physically apart. All right, so we have one final webinar, as Stephanie mentioned earlier. It is on Saturday, June 27th at 10 in the morning, and it's on visual budgets and how to engage your spreadsheet. So taking this information and moving it into a different direction. All right. Now that I don't see anything else, let's close in prayer. If anyone does have questions and you would like to hang around and ask them, just stick around after the prayer. Otherwise, we will look forward to seeing you at our next webinar and through our website and Facebook page. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Eternal God of love, in you we live and move and have our being. Breathe through us again this day. Give us the courage to be open and welcoming to your Spirit, that we may be led to do your will and follow in your ways today and tomorrow. Amen.
Amen.
All right, thanks everybody. It has been great to see you, and we will look forward to seeing you on Saturday.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye everybody.